Hello. What a pleasure it is to have you. I'm going to call you Cat, if that's okay. It's a lovely name. Reminds me of, a cat. James has never told me how lucky he was. His taste in women is the same as his taste in podcasts, so as I see. Only the very best. So, James tells me that you have some concerns I can alleviate.
Yes, I do. I have concerns. If we're going to go down this road, I need some assurances that we're going to go about this in a manner that is extremely safe and cautious.
Fair enough. All right. I'll walk you through the process. First step is something we like to call episode prep. All right. And so first you take your notes, represented by, these jelly beans. And,
I am a part-time host, so I actually... I know what podcasting is.
Well.
And as with most things, the devil is in the details. So to begin with, what are we saying is the focus of this episode?
Well, that's simple. James here actually came up with a great idea to cover a whole series, season by season, right?
Actually, that was Kat's idea.
Oh, well, you grow more brilliant by the minute. Well, there you have it. I'll generate YouTube clips out the wazoo, as well as the necessary social media posts. I know a couple admins who will jump at the chance to help us advertise.
Yeah, but you can't sell that for very long.
Yep. Way ahead of you. We'll tease out just long enough to arouse interest, then we release the episode.
Episode on what?
Drum roll, please. Wait for it. Breaking Bad.
In a world where entertainment is viewed as mindless diversion, only good for momentary distraction, one podcast has taken a stand, thoughtfully engaging the art of our day, dissecting the narrative, and pointing the people back to the greatest storyteller of all. You are about to enter a new world, and you will never view entertainment in the same way again. This is Popcorn Theology.
Welcome, movie lovers and theology nerds, to episode 355 of Popcorn Theology, where we examine films for where they align with the greatest story and our greatest storyteller, discussing what to receive, reject, and redeem for common ground, fruitful conversation, and mindful movie consumption. I'm David.
And I'm James.
And I'm Kat.
And we are looking at season 3 of Breaking Bad,
Yay.
Created by Vince Gilligan and starring Bryan Cranston, Aaron Paul, Anna Gunn, Dean Norris, Giancarlo Esposito, Bob Odenkirk, and more. Many more.
Many more, yes. Had to elevate Dean Norris to top billing for this episode, because we got to talk Hank, for sure. And, there is so much that we can easily get into with any of the seasons of this show. But and we normally do a little episode summary, or a little movie summary here when we're covering movies. But we're going to obviously put a pause on that because we don't want to spoil everything in the show until we drop the spoiler warning. So we're going to get straight into our rankings. So before we get to spoilers, we're going to give this season some Popcorn Theology ratings. And so this is going to be from a popcorn perspective. Basically, rather than saying that a show or movie is bad, good, or great, we say that it is stale, fresh, or buttered and salted. So I guess we'll go ladies first on this. Kat, would you say that this was, where would you put it in those ratings?
I think I'd say fresh to buttered and salted. I was a bit put off at the beginning of the season as we were still kind of dealing with some of the aftermath of season 2. And I think we spoke to some of our slight frustrations at the end of season 2. So we're dealing with, there's still going to be a little bit of spoilers, right? Like Jesse ends up Jesse ends up in rehab. Walt and Skyler are separated, and some of the frustrating decisions that are coming out of those
Spoiler, people make frustrating decisions.
in Breaking Bad. Yeah.
As long as we're not
true.
talking the last couple episodes, I won't count them as spoilers.
But then it picks up, and I actually appreciated some of the character arcs, specifically some of the secondary characters that we get to see a little bit more, or maybe even tertiary characters, but we get to see a little bit more of them. Some people that had been slightly frustrating actually weirdly start to make better decisions, whereas the main characters continue to make bad decisions. So I really appreciated some of that nuance. I think one of the things that makes Breaking Bad really great actually is the nuance of all of the characters. There's a great depth to the characters. No one is a single one note character. So I appreciated all of that in this season as some of those things really begin to get rounded out. Even as I struggle, the characters seem absolutely determined to always only make the wrong choice or take the wrong lesson from any epiphany that they might come their way. I've been joking that this show is, in any given moment, any character is going to make the absolute wrong choice.
Worst possible decision.
Worst possible choice. The acting's still incredible. The storytelling's still incredible. And it honestly just seems to be getting richer and better as we go in that sense. So I did really appreciate that.
As some characters get richer. Anyways.
And maybe not better.
And the filmmaker, or the showrunners for that matter. They're getting, everyone's making more money now.
That's right.
Good stuff. James, what did you think?
Well, I'm the one who took it down last season 2. I'm the one who probably had the most complaints, and I'll go back up to Buttered and Salted. I think the season really rattled I think I'll talk about this once we're in spoiler territory, but my expectations got rattled at the beginning, but ultimately shook out, I think, with a far stronger ending as far as season 3 goes. Season 2, I felt like the plane incident just didn't land for me. There you go.
No, it didn't.
That narrative point kind of crashed and burned a little bit.
Wow.
Oh boy.
Yeah, but this season had, I think, some even greater moments and greater monologues from characters, which I'm excited to be able to talk about as we get into it. And so this sort of brought it back up. Catherine, I shared a little frustration maybe in the first half, but then it ended so strong. It's tremendous. So what about you, man?
No, I will agree. It is funny though, because you brought it back up in season 3, and I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe it's because I feel the need to, try and put a lid on my enthusiasm for this show by not just giving everyone the highest possible ranking. But for me, I almost called it fresh, not buttered and salted. And it's not because it's bad. It's because I know where it's going. And I want to say it got better. And it does, but I will still call it buttered and salted, but lightly, as if the guy just kind of started there and he's not really getting the hang of how much butter, always more butter, always more salt. It was good. Don't get me wrong. And I will say momentum is the best way to describe this season, in my opinion. If we're doing the one word summary thing that some shows do, this is where the show starts to pick up. I remember eventually this show, I think, gets to the point where almost every episode has a season finale vibe to it. The weight, the heft. I mean, just the fact that I find myself I forgot to breathe for a while I'm watching it,
Wow.
And we're getting there. We're not quite there, but we're getting there. And many of the episodes have that. The suspense, action, the drama, it's all ratcheting up. The stakes are getting higher gradually. And I will agree, some of the events of season 2, I think maybe jumped the shark a little bit in the stakes department without getting into it too much. But we get the introduction of a new character as well, the Super Lab, right? And so this is one of the more iconic sets, if you will, for Breaking Bad. And this is finally where we get to see them in that environment. Meanwhile, we see things happening with other sets, them being retired, if you will. But we also get some of the most memorable moments of the show, including a shootout and Something About a Fly, and some revelations from Skyler, and of course, like you said, James, the monologues. So many monologues, and they're amazing, and they don't feel like, oh, this is out of place in real life. That they're monologuing. No, it's beautiful. I would say many heart-pounding showstoppers, but again, it's starting to build that momentum where I would say, without trying to overhype it, it gets better.
I'll try to tamp down my expectations, having not seen it.
I know. This is the worst thing. When I try and tell people to watch this show, I always overhype it. And that's just, But I will say that while it is arguably stronger than seasons 1 and 2, to me, it still kind of occupies this in-between space. Like 1 and 2, we have the setup for the, essentially everything. Because season 1 was so short, that spilled over so much into season 2. And then 4 and 5 are what I would say a fever pitch. 3 is kind of that little in between in my mind.
It's the middle child. It's sad. It's the sad middle child. It's not the.
Is it Malcolm?
Yeah, there we go.
It's not the firstborn or the sort of the youngest. It's that middle child it's caught in the middle. It is. Yeah, Malcolm in the middle. I like that.
Fantastic. So I'm curious, have you guys watched past? Because I know you're both watching the show for the first time. Have you watched past the season 3 finale? Even by 5 minutes? No?
Nope.
Not at all. Okay, well, I can't wait to... All right, so spoiler territory is still a couple minutes down the road, but we all know that a TV show's quality doesn't always reflect its depth of theological talking points. So when it comes to the deeper themes within this story, we have another rating system, which is that it is either diluted, meaning it's okay, or it is carbonated, meaning it's got an average amount of talking points, or the cup is running over, much like the excess product that we see eventually in the lab. So what do you guys think? Would you say diluted, carbonated, or the crucible runneth over? Kat?
I'm probably carbonated to runneth over. I mean, honestly, the show is so rich. It's so obviously there's so much to talk about. But I did feel like I'm not sure if this season really opened up a ton of new ground. But I do feel like the characters are pointed somewhere and the themes are kind of pointing in a particular direction. So I'm curious to see where it goes. I mean, there were some great moments, like you guys talked about some of the monologues. So there's some great character work that really dove into what should be epiphanies for people. And that was part of my my frustration. And my frustration isn't with the show. My frustration is ultimately with the characters, and the characters legitimately just absolutely always making the wrong choice. They're presented with a moral dilemma. They're presented with, and they always choose the wrong path. And so honestly, as a that's rich to pull apart and talk about.
And that's why you're wrong. This is totally cup runneth over season.
I mean, you're not wrong. You're not.
No. We need some drama. Like, no. We disagree.
Oh, you're totally wrong. You're totally wrong.
Jerry.
There we go.
But I mean, there's so many fascinating character moments. There's so many fascinating elements that come into play, and
that's
so
my point. That's my point. We have so many ancillary characters that get a little more interesting.
It's true.
Meat
It's
to
true.
them.
I mean, Mike the Fixer, amazing.
Yeah.
But there's some really just frustrating character moments where I feel like what should be this epiphany, you're kind of like, oh yes, no, that's not the choice you're supposed to make.
Yeah.
And there's this.
So we'll get to that. Wait. We need to hear David's though. Where's David in the whole?
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if we've thoroughly heard.
Well,
James's,
wait. I was just going to say that there's a huge theme of like the hypocritical nature of human nature and how we justify our own behavior and our own actions, and it's ultimately hypocritical and this self-justification. So there is, I think that plays a huge part of this season. Is that continuing justification so that it tries to absolve what they've done before and justify what they've done before, but then it also lays the groundwork for them to continue in that behavior. And so there is, you're not wrong, James, there is a lot that can be talked about, a lot that can be pulled apart, parsed out, and argued over what's the best choice. And they're all hard choices, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a right and wrong within that. So there is actually a lot to talk about. So fine. And running, potentially dribbling over the edge a little bit.
Count it. All right. Well, it sounds like James has won the argument for today.
Yes. I know, David, you could break the
tie.
It's one-on-one.
I don't know. I think maybe I'm sure that there's of course a subjective aspect to all of this, but I'm leaning towards carbonated because at least the main things that jump out to me are kind of treading some of the same thematic ground as the first two seasons, especially season 2. But it does seem to reveal more and more of the dire situation and the morally compromised position that Walt and Jesse find themselves in again and again, even though they've been trying like heck to avoid being put in the trunk of a car again, for example, stuff like that. They're trying to get out of all of those crazy hijinks. But it also forces them to confront the men that they've become. There's a fair bit of discussion in this episode or in this season about what kind of man so-and-so is. And I mean, you may call it on the nose to actually phrase it like that, but I thought it was appropriate because of the content of the show and the events that are happening. But I will say it does seem to put many of the unstated themes from earlier seasons into really good dialogue and really good monologues. I would say some of the more quotable moments from the show are actually right here in this middle child of the season. And so, we're at roughly a halfway point, depending which episode we're talking about throughout the entire show. And so it's, I would say it's continuing its trajectory quality-wise, but in terms of discussion points and themes, as with any show, if we were to rate it on a whole, I'd say we would maybe rate it higher than the individual components. But I don't know. It looks like there's maybe a little bit of drama here.
I'm saying it's the meaty middle. That's my point, right? It's the meaty middle right there. Okay.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like we got more to get into once we drop the spoiler warning and once we dive deeper. But before we do that, we want to encourage you to go ahead and like and share this episode with your friends. If you like what you hear, you want to give out samples, you want to let them see that it's the bomb. You want to, make sure that product is getting out there.
Is it the bomb?
Yeah, and if you want to hear more, make sure you subscribe on YouTube, follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Discord, YouTube, so you don't miss when a new batch comes out.
That's right.
I mean, one quick way you can help support the podcast is just to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And even though every hit is free, you're still encouraged to support us financially through Patreon.
That's right. Donating just a few bucks a month will make you a patron saint. This gives you special access to a whole host of exclusive benefits, including a Facebook group and our special channel on the public Discord server. Vote on future episodes. We don't make you go out on the street and try to bring in new customers. But for our special premium seating members, you do get special weekly In the Lobby podcast episodes, and you can join us live while we record. So there are perks to be had.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, we may not have you going out on the street and, and slinging episodes, but, it wouldn't hurt if maybe next, if you find yourself in a small circle of friends who are recovering together from whatever it is, you want to share a taste, that wouldn't be the worst thing. But yeah, as far as the In the Lobby series, I just like to plug that again because we got some really great monthly content. And again, it actually is broken down into weekly episodes. It's essentially a whole second set of episodes. And I just want to encourage people to check that out. You get the first one each month for free, and then the others are released just for Patreon supporters, patron saints. And so check those out. And we just recorded one the other day that's going to release through the month of September on popcorn politics. And so, we kind of get into some of the political and social discussion surrounding entertainment. And one of the ones that's about to release by the time this does, I'm pretty excited about, is Popcorn Theology 101. Some of the common burning questions that people have about film and entertainment, we asked to Professor Harleman here. And so we're going to be releasing those publicly. So I want to encourage you to share those. And of course, we got stickers. I have them somewhere, believe me. I'll have them after the break. I'll show you after the break. We got some stickers. And so become a patron saint and you get a free sticker. Pretty good stuff. And so we're going to go ahead and drop some ads, and we'll be back with a spoiler warning as we peel back the layers on Season 3 of Breaking Bad.
Yo, drop the ads. Hey, this is James, and if you're listening to Popcorn Theology, it's because you're interested in movies, or theology, or best of all, both. And that probably means you're our kind of people, sharing things in common with our community, and maybe sharing common interests our listeners and viewers would be interested in as well. So why not partner with us and advertise your business or ministry right here on Popcorn Theology? We're looking for great, like-minded sponsors and offer reasonable rates with a variety of formats to get your message out. Remember, our fans aren't mindless consumers, so they'll give you thoughtful consideration. That's big part of what we're all about. So for more information on advertising with us, contact info@popcorntheology.com.
Popcorn Theology has been mindfully viewing cinema from a godly perspective since 2015. But why? Where did it come from? Well, one of the inspirations was our host, James Harleman's book, Cinemagogue, published in 2012, exploring the intersections between film and faith. And now, fresh off the press, is an updated edition of the book, the Cinemagogue Director's Cut. This version contains over 40 pages of new content with reviews and recommendations, movie references, illustrations, further shaping the story-formed argument for God's existence while also delving deeper on hot topics like how we deal with sex and nudity in film. It's the how-to guide for all things popcorn theology. And this time, it's not just available on Kindle and in paperback, but also a hardcover edition for all you true book lovers. So if you like movies, if you're a cinephile, if you spend hours talking film, this book is definitely for you. Or if you're a casual consumer who thinks movie making exists merely for diversion, this book may just change your life. Cinemagogue available now at Amazon.com. For bulk orders or signed copies, check out Cinemagogue.com for details.
Ma senti cosa dice quel povero infelice. Non ti lamentar, ma prova a cantar nonno in questa canzone.
All right, we're back, dropping the spoiler warning as we dig deeper into Breaking Bad Season 3. But we're going to get to our popcorn thoughts in just a moment, and everyone can, explain their ratings from before a little bit more thoroughly now that we're past the spoiler warning. But, we figured for those who haven't seen the show in a while, it can be tricky to remember, at least I struggled with, remembering where one season starts and another season ends. Because,
Where
again,
are we?
the cliffhangers are so dramatic. And so we figure a little refresher wouldn't hurt. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with that. James, do you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Me. Season 3 starts with Jesse in therapy, grieving Jane's death, while Walt is reeling from his wife leaving him, not to mention that fateful crash of 2 airliners resulting in hundreds of deaths. After being pushed out of his house, Walt is trying to reconcile with Skyler, who's figured out that he's in the drug trade and starts having an affair with her boss as a means of revenge. While a new cartel threat makes its way up from the border, Walt keeps refusing an irresistible multi-million-dollar offer from the chicken mogul, Gus Fring.
Meanwhile, Jesse gets clean, buys his old house back, and eventually starts cooking meth again. Walt is livid with Jesse for using his recipe, which Gus uses to manipulate Walt into cooking in a swanky new underground super lab with his new assistant, Gail. This arrangement keeps Walt safe from 2 axe-wielding killers who are hell-bent on revenge for their cousin, Tuco.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yeah.
And then Hank is invited back to El Paso, but instead throws himself into the hunt for Heisenberg, circling in on that elusive RV, which we know belongs to our protagonist, and he links it to Jesse. Walt and Jesse then barely escape Hank's grasp with some trickery involving his wife, which then causes Hank to beat Jesse senseless. And to keep Jesse from pressing charges and ending Hank's career, Walt arranges for Jesse to replace Gale and makes him a 50-50 partner once again. So problem is the cousins then get Gus's permission to get revenge on Hank, and Hank then instead barely manages to kill them and escape with his life.
That's right. A lot happening. And then Hank, as he slowly recovers, the cooks make loads and loads of money working with Gus, but Jesse begins to feel shortchanged and starts skimming meth from the drug dealers in order to sell to recovering addicts of all people. There, he meets and falls for Andrea before finding out that her 11-year-old brother, Tomas, works for two of Gus's dealers selling the infamous blue meth, and that he murdered Combo back in season 2. When Jesse's revenge plans result in Tomas being killed, Walt actually steps in, saving Jesse's life and killing the two dealers responsible. Gus then tries to kill Walt and Jesse, but Walt plans to save his skin by sacrificing Gale, the lab assistant, who was slated to replace him. But as Walt is being marched to his death, he asks Jesse to take down Gale instead. So season 3 ends with Gale pleading for his life while Jesse tearfully pulls the trigger. It's heavy.
That's
no
a lot.
question. And a lot happens in this season for sure. And we even cut some stuff out, to be honest, just to keep it a little clean. There's more that happens with Skyler in particular, and with Hank and the recovery and all of that. But yeah, that's the very big picture summary. So if you somehow haven't watched the show, this is on you. We dropped a spoiler warning. But
Too late now.
ahead. It's way too late. We're going to jump into our popcorn thoughts. So, yeah, there we go. All right. So, Kat, you thought that it was, I believe you said buttered and salted.
I think I said fresh to
you
butter
did say
and
fresh.
salted.
My apologies.
Yes.
Yeah, on the
But
fresh
no,
side.
I mean, but
I got to
was
scroll.
leaning.
Debbie
was
Downer
leaning-
thought it was just fresh.
I was
Worst
leaning
show
toward butter.
ever. I'm sorry. So fresh. So, what were some thoughts that you had? Some things you liked or didn't like? Standout moments. Yeah.
I think Gus really came into his own for me in this season.
Gus.
Gus. Yeah. Seriously, that guy is playing some fourth dimensional chess, and I love it. Like that kind of stuff is amazing. And I really appreciate the difference between him and Walt. So I've recently found the Giancarlo Esposito "We Are Not the Same" meme, which I'm not 100% sure if that's a Breaking Bad thing or if it's just like a photo shoot of Giancarlo Esposito. Do you guys have any idea what I'm talking about?
I think I've seen it. Yeah.
I'm
I
sure
know
the
the meme,
internet
yeah.
knows, but it's basically a picture of Giancarlo Esposito in a suit with a tie, and he's kind of adjusting the tie and looking very cool. And it basically says like, you like this thing, whatever it is, for this reason. I like it for this reason. We are not the same.
Okay.
Right?
Maybe I haven't seen it.
And I feel very much like if it's not a Breaking Bad reference or that it didn't come from Breaking Bad, it is to me the
It
epitome
should.
of
Yeah.
it should. Yeah, it's Gus versus Walt in that sense. Like
We're
Walt
not the same.
thinks we are not the same. Walt thinks he's the smartest man in the room, and he begins to realize that he's not. Even if it's only barely that he begins to realize it, but he starts to realize, oh, Gus knows what he's doing, and the lack of emotionality that Gus shows as he commences his business is a stark contrast to how Walt deals with his upsets this season.
Yeah, I
And I
mean,
found that
we can't
very
mistake
fascinating.
Gus's meekness for weakness, right? I think that's what this season
Correct.
shows.
Yeah.
Oh
is
no,
that-
he's absolutely ruthless,
diabolical.
but he is absolutely controlled in what he's doing and how he's going about it. It's very different from Walt. And I think I really, really appreciated what they did with Hank and Marie, because Hank and Marie to me earlier were annoying. And I really appreciated that they're kind of actually making their marriage deeper and better. And Walter and Skyler are falling apart.
Yeah,
Right.
that's an interesting
so those-
contrast.
Yeah, those interesting contrasts I found very fascinating. And most of the things that I would say I didn't like about this season aren't really the show itself. It's more the character moments, just where the characters are going and what they're doing and the choices that they're making. So I feel like there's so many characters that are being hypocritical in how they're judging others versus their own actions, right? That way that we tend to, it's okay if I do it. It's not okay if you do it. And there's so much of that on display that I think James will vouch for me that there were a couple times I was like yelling at the TV. I was so angry with some of the characters.
In her defense, not during the episode, but like after the episode.
During the credits. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like Walt's indignation at Skyler for lying to him and betraying him. And you're like, oh, you mean like you lied to your wife and betrayed her.
Yeah.
Jesse feeling guilty about Jane, but then starting to sell to recovering addicts. You're like, what are you doing, man? What are you doing? And how Jesse and Walt still seem to feel like they're so much better than anyone else that they're dealing with. And you're like, no, man, you're in the drug trade, right? Like, I think at one point Walt even says kind of like, it's meth, but I'm not a dealer. I just make it. Like, no, that's not an excuse. That you're no better. You're no better. And yet he absolutely thinks he's better than everyone else that he's dealing with. And so it was those character moments that were really interesting and intriguing to watch. Fantastic acting, really well thought out storytelling, paced well. But just frustrating character moments as I said before, it just seems like every moment when someone is confronted with the consequences of their actions or experiences something that should be an epiphany, they take the absolute wrong message or wrong epiphany and continue down this horrible path. Like every time you're presented with a moral quandary, they take the exact wrong option and
almost feels like we're reading. It almost feels like we're reading the Old Testament, like First and Second Kings or something. Not to jump ahead to the theology, just too fast.
It absolutely is. Everyone,
or when you're playing a video game and it's like you got the Paragon or the Renegade option for the sort of the.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is like everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes and justifying themselves with their behavior, and somehow again, it's that really hypocritical. Like, how dare you betray me? You're like, but you betrayed me.
So I could see how some Christians wouldn't like the show just because the weight of it at some point. I mean, it just keeps heaping more on the scale of this issue that you're talking about. And at some point, like I can see how some people are like, I get this, and I got to check out because it's just too much. Like I can understand some people not liking the show because it just piles on to the point of being frustrating to the. Maybe frustrating beyond some people's limits, and that
absolutely.
Like I get it,
yeah, and especially if we're dealing. I mean, but to a sense, I feel like it makes sense for these characters, right? If we're surprised that an addict is going back to his addiction, which turns out is not meth, it is in fact selling meth and being the bad guy, as he claims. That I think makes some sense that there's going to be some super irrational behavior, as opposed to what you might see in like a Christian movie where like, oh, I was a drug dealer and then Jesus saved me and I've never struggled ever since. That's so great.
Yay. Yeah.
Exactly. So, James, you brought this up into the buttered and salted category. And so same questions.
I did, because I think the only thing that I didn't like about this season is really not kind of similar to Cat. It's not something in this story itself. It's something that other people in media led me to believe about this show. And as to what frustrated me was having an expectation flipped on its head. At least in season 3, I guess it could change in season 4 and 5. But I had the idea, the way everybody talked about the show, that in a much earlier way, we would see Walt become something of a criminal this mastermind crime lord. And frankly, what frustrated me is like, no, this season 3 is showing me like he's a fool, and perhaps more than ever this season. It really shows when he's contrast with the real masterminds around him in this season, from the cousins in the house just sizing him up while he's oblivious in the shower, to obviously then his comparison to Gus, comparison even to Saul, who's a bit sort of shoot from the hip, but still smarter than Walt. And then even the great speech with Mike, which we'll talk about later. I mean, Walt has this incredible fight and flight survival instinct, this sort of last minute desperation ability to troubleshoot. I think he'd be great in an escape room with some friends, right?
Yeah.
He has that ability, but when it comes to anything big picture in this season, he's just proving himself this inept fool with Gus, as Kat said, as the chess player. And so my favorite moment in this scene, though, has nothing to do with Walt or any of the other characters that have really been front and center. It actually comes from, as a few of you, we've already alluded to a little bit, my favorite moment of the season is actually Mike's speech. Maybe my favorite part of the show thus far.
Yeah.
The No More Half Measures speech, right, as we're getting toward the end of the season, was an amazing moment and just a beautiful piece of, as we say, like, it's a monologue, but not monologuing in the negative villain monologuing sense. It is an earned,
in the Incredibles type way. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not monologuing like in the Incredibles, but it is incredible. It is amazing. And what's the actor's name, Kat?
Jonathan Banks.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Oh, wow.
Interrupt.
Thank you.
Kudos, David. David got it.
KOTB failed. Buffering.
No, so far he's delivered what I think is my favorite moment of 3 seasons of this show, with that interchange between he and Walt. And so we'll talk about that later. But
it's still so funny to me that you guys were first exposed to him on Community. Like, to me, when he rounds that corner and you see Jonathan Banks in the office in Community, I was like, what? And same for Gus, that you introduced to both of these guys in Community, not here. That is so weird to me. Anyway, I'm sorry. Continue.
No. Over to you then. You thought it was lightly buttered and salted. So where are you at?
Yeah, I would say it is certainly picking up the momentum that I mentioned earlier, right? So it is buttered and salted, but I can't bring myself to say that it's as good as it can be because I've watched the rest. And so the stakes are starting to increase. And I will agree that the body count did spike at the end of season 2, but the personal stakes were still fairly remote. I mean, and to nitpick again a little bit more on season 2, we didn't see the face of a single person. They didn't even interchange it with a character we know getting on the plane, or even a character we've been introduced to or seen them in passing. I mean, and they could have followed the teddy bear as like a little girl carried it onto the plane or something. They could have done it some slightly different ways. But one thing that I think that this show does an amazing job with, and it's always, I think, with maybe that exception, because I think you convinced me that was a little out of place, that after pondering our last episode, that I think the show does an amazing job with is really making each life heavy, making the loss of each life. And it did this all the way back with Crazy 8, right? Where there's the debate over ending his life, where even the bad guys are, you don't want them to die, right? Like to an extent. And even the ones that you're more comfortable with, like, oh, they were bad and they needed to go. They usually don't have lines or have almost no lines. Like the 2 guys that get shot at the end, they never say a word to anyone. And so it's like, yeah, go ahead. They're gone. But Gale, he's almost innocent. He's like a puppy, you know? Like, it hurts so bad. And like this show does
not. Not a puppy.
Right. Innocent as you can be and be a meth dealer, right?
In this
Breaking
show.
Bad, yeah.
Relative to Breaking Bad, right? Exactly. Yeah. And so
Rating got a curve.
Yeah, exactly. And so I do think that they make the weight of the decisions and the life count. Shows like this make, I think, the human life seem so much more valuable, like it is, as opposed to a shoot 'em up, which just mows people down. And it's like, oh, people are stunt doubles. But in season 3, we get a lot of chickens coming home to roost from seasons 1 and 2. Obviously, we've got 2 silent but menacing villains haunting the first half of the season. We've got Gus kind of going from being this seemingly safe, calm businessman to we're starting to see a bit more of a revelation of who he really is. Mike is playing a bigger and bigger role, and we're realizing Mike is just heartless in so many ways, contrasted with the way he interacts with his granddaughter, which is wild. And there's depth to characters that get to have depth, and then some of them don't really get to have much depth. But in any case, despite these high stakes, season 3 is still funny somehow. It has still got the laughs. We still get comedic antics. We get some slapstick even a little bit. And, you know, the antics that the guys are getting into in the lab. And even with the RV, even though the stakes are high in the RV, I was so glad to see the two of them back together in it again. Even a lot of uncomfortable chuckles, like when Mike is threatening Saul and Saul is like trying to, you know, man up and show him. And all Mike has to do is kind of flinch at him. I bust up every time. It's such a great character moment. But we also get flashbacks. I love that this season makes good use of time. We get flashbacks to happier moments, right? When Jesse and Jane are still together. When Walt and Skyler are looking at their house. The cousins as kids, admittedly less of a happy memory. But, you know, we get all of these flashbacks and all of these opening sequences that serve as short films. And that's one great thing, by the way. This isn't a sponsorship at all, but there's this Alan Sepinwall's book, Breaking Bad 101. There's little essays in here for each of the seasons, and he really breaks down a lot of those opening scenes. They're so good, of various genres. And there's the one with the cousins where they killed the lady, and it's just like straight horror. I love it. And so this season's so good that it pains me to not say that it's as buttered and salted as it can be, but I'm trying to leave a roof on that. So.
I think actually, speaking to some of those points too, this season, as much as we may have kind of quibbled with some of the plane crash stuff in last season, what I think they were trying to get at is that idea that like your actions aren't in a vacuum. Like this season,
right? I think this season does it better.
Perhaps, but you still see then even something as far-reaching or as abstract as like a plane crash, there's a trail of wreckage that gets you there, and it's Walt making a decision to not save Jane. It's then that woman's father is then distraught. Then he doesn't do his job well. Then you end up with this horrible event, right? Like. That idea that our sin, we do not understand the ripples of our own behavior. And Walt thinks he's just trying to protect his family, but in trying to protect his family, he sets in motion all this other stuff. And so I do think that this season, like you were saying, David, some of those chickens coming home to roost, that idea is very, very well fleshed out in season 3, which probably then pushes it into the my cup runneth over sort of idea. Like there's so much rich stuff to talk about because you're not in a vacuum.
Because that whole cause and effect domino thing comes into sharper effect with the combo death and Jesse's new girlfriend. It makes it more personal than, as you were saying, David, with the lack of personal touch of the airplane occupants. Like here it all makes sense. Here you see how it comes full circle in a more dramatic way to every little person and things you didn't realize you were contributing to. So
and even the foreshadowing, so the fact that this kid carried out the hit on Combo, that's planted way back in season 2 when it happened, and no delivery on that ever since. Those characters, there's incredibly long-term storytelling happening here that is unparalleled. For sure.
The craft of the seasons and the storytelling and the structuring of everything is impeccable. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now that we're in season 3, around the halfway point, we get to briefly dive into arguably the most divisive Breaking Bad episode, Fly, which I didn't realize until... Divisive? Yeah. People are really torn on whether this is a good episode or not. This is a hot button thing. I don't know because you guys were a bit removed from the kind of discussion surrounding these episodes when they dropped. But this episode, and maybe it makes sense that it was directed by Rian Johnson. I didn't know that until I read
the Last Jedi Breaking Bad episode. There you go.
I didn't know that until I read this, and I just was like, really, Rian Johnson? Huh? And so, what we got here is a bit of a bottle episode. And so for those who don't know, the idea of a bottle episode is basically the filmmakers trying to essentially save some money and allow the show to go other places in terms of things like special effects and sets and cast by having an episode or two that are contained in a small area in a small space, where we're just kind of working with the sets and the characters that we have. And so we have Flies, the episode where they're contained in the lab, almost the entire episode, just trying to kill this fly that's contaminating the lab. So I'm curious where you guys landed on it. Did you think it was a compelling, interesting episode, or just kind of a weird sidetrack, waste of time, artsy thing? So thoughts, Kat?
I actually really liked it. Combination of things. One, I think James will be able to again attest to this. I freaking hate flies.
She's crazy. Crazy.
Like
crazy.
Like I can borderline, I'm unable to work if there is a fly in my office because I hear it buzzing, and then they always tend to like buzz right past my ear. And so I'm like typing, and then I'm suddenly like, like this. Yeah. Oh, I hate it. So honestly, as ridiculous as it seems, I kind of felt for Walt. I was like, oh no, I get it, man. There's a fly in there that would make me insane.
This fly has to be dealt with. Yeah.
yeah. But it was, I think too, though, it, as far as bottle episodes go, like it didn't really feel, I don't believe that it felt super forced, other than maybe one could argue the fact that Walt went that bonkers about like locking down the thing, and so then they're stuck there. But then everything that happened, it was such a raw and emotional episode of Walt getting so close to telling Jesse about Jane, and then yet not, and yet his sorrow, his deep sorrow at the circumstances of what happened, what he chose to do. And it, honestly, it was so good acting wise and story wise and character wise. And yet at the same time, it was so cruel because the show kind of continues this theme of people talking past each other, like people thinking that they understand what the person's referencing or talking about. That was a huge piece of season 1, right? Where Skyler thinks that it's all about Walt dealing with his cancer, and it's him hiding his drug making, and it's, or then she thinks it's him having an affair, but it's him hiding his drugs. And this way that the characters sort of understand a little bit, but kind of actually miss true ultimate communication, because Jesse never fully understands exactly what Walt is so sorrowful about. Right. And, and so it was a really amazing emotional episode, and yet still that kind of frustrating, like you guys still aren't actually connecting, understanding, or communicating with each other. Honestly, that stunt fall was bonkers. Like, I don't know how they did that without killing somebody.
Well, it looked like it was him. I keep watching that. I'm like, they did some good stunt work there, because I know that wasn't him.
Yeah, and I've watched a couple of episodes about stunt stuff, like specifically these other YouTubers that do kind of comment on stunt things, and that's actually where I first encountered that stunt fall. Was they were like, oh my gosh, this stunt in Breaking Bad is amazing, and then we hit that episode, and I was like, oh, that's that episode. So, I mean, just some incredible work, just acting wise. And then even just props to the stunt people and what they accomplished. But
go Fall Guy. Yeah.
Well, and Walt is not upset about the fly. It's representative of his recognition of his inability to control everything. And so it's a brilliant metaphor. And I really appreciated that, because I had heard of this episode. I remember hearing about it only as if it was a legendary episode in a good way and kind of revered. So I didn't know there was a division between folks. And so I thought, and going into it, I was like, I know I'm going to hit this episode. In my head, I was like, I wonder if it's going to be self-indulgent and there's just going to be this strange preoccupation with the fly. It's like, no, this obviously had to do with much larger things. It wasn't just about them trying to get the fly. It was all these sort of half confessions. So and it also came to a moment where I think, to me, it's the most pivotal moment for Walt in the entirety of the series thus far. And that's where he says, "I've lived too long."
Yeah.
It reminded me of actually a line from The Dark Knight where Harvey Dent says, you either die a hero or you live long enough to become the villain.
Ooh.
And he's like, I wish I could have died here. Because here I could have died. And I think in a weird way, he's referencing that movie without knowing it. Like, I wish I could have died here and been a hero for my family, had the money, like done the thing. But like, I've now passed this point, and tie in that other point in the season where he says, like, I can't be the bad guy. It's like, it's too late. He's lived long enough to become the villain. So there's this strange, Miles Wallace will appreciate the fact that I tied this to Batman. I got
Once
a Batman
again,
reference in here.
Yet again, without Miles here. It still happens every time. Oh, man.
But it really does resonate with that.
Yeah.
I was like, he's having a Harvey Dent moment. That line in The Dark Knight is so poignant. Like, some of us, like, if I died here, people would remember me as a hero. But shoot, I kept going on. It's like King David. Like, oh, shoot, I've lived. I slayed Goliath. I did all this. It'd be great. Oh, wait, now I've got the Bathsheba Uriah thing. Like, I've gone on past my hero moment, and now I've got this stain. And this episode brought that home so well. I think, no, to me, it right now it stands as a pivotal, like almost center point for the sort of the tipping point of the show. And
Yeah.
so I would not waste, like, kudos to Rian Johnson. I still like The Last Jedi. So, we still listen to our last year.
I was
Shots
going to say.
fired.
Shots fired.
No, I'll defend Last Jedi a little bit as well.
Yeah.
But
So Rian Johnson, I think, delivered here, and obviously it wasn't just him, but
Oh, yeah.
like this delivered
He
a
directed.
pivotal character point for this series.
Yeah.
And like I did say, I said Mike's speech is the most important thing, but like that admission from Walt is probably like my number 2 favorite thing about this show so far. So
yeah,
there you go.
There's so much that we see the show, we see the characters and all these events through Walt's eyes primarily, which means that there's not a lot of self-awareness on Walt's part. It's more Walt interacting and reacting with things, at least for the time being. But this is one of the rare ones where we actually get something, not just through Walt's eyes, but from Walt's mouth, that we say, oh, wow, didn't know that. For the most part, there's not a ton of mystery behind why Walt does what he does, because he's the one we're meant to identify with. But you're right. This is where we get something from him that is a bit surprising, where it's like, I didn't expect that that's what was under the surface there. Yeah, I agree. And it's brilliant, even down to the last, frame of the episode where, he sees the light above his bed and the fly is still there. I mean, it's just this elusive, ever out of reach thing, right? And it's just something very Ecclesiastes about it, right? But I agree. I think that it was brilliant. It was kind of back in true form in a way. We had a ton of drama and tension between Walt and Jesse for the first half of the season. And the fact that we actually get them on the same team again is not just satisfying for a fan, but it also helps us kind of realize that these two are in orbit together, and there's an attraction between them where they just can't help but be drawn to one another in this surrogate father-son relationship that they have. And it's a return to formula, if you will.
This episode has a moment that kind of turns that on its head as well, because Walt ends up kind of passing out, right? And Jesse sort of takes care of Walt for that moment.
Yeah.
Tucks him into bed and is kind of like, all right, I'll see you in the morning, that kind of thing. Like, there's this little moment where Jesse becomes the father figure for just a moment as he's taking care of Walt.
It's true.
And so, for little things like that, like this show it's very, very clever and very well written with those moments and those turns and different things that happen.
For sure. And I will say that about this episode. Obviously, the suspense builds in terms of the physical events, right? He's up on top of that ladder and you're watching it like, oh, no. Like, that's bad. But there's that almost confession from Walt, which is yet another sign that Walt just can't handle his drugs. like his partner can, right? Like in a show about people using and dealing drugs, Walt is clean, except he tries pot once, I think in the show one time. But every time he's under anesthesia, something slips out, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? And so we get to see a little bit of that, even, before we pour the soda here. And so speaking of which, we're going to go ahead and sample some of the more spiritual aspects of this season and its narrative. And there's so much to discuss. We're going to try and keep a decent pace because we've already kind of alluded to a lot of these already. I mean, sure. Just glancing at my notes, there's a lot here that
there's a lot
that we've already kind of touched on. And so I'm just going to jog. If you don't mind, I'm going to hop into my point because my point is kind of early in the season, so it makes narrative sense. So my big takeaway.
Start cooking.
Let's cook. My big takeaway in this season is how characters are responding to guilt. And so, as we've already mentioned, Walt is, in a sense, reeling from the effects of what happened at the end of season 2. But one other great thing about this show, and I guess this is almost a bit of a step back from that theme, is how brilliantly it sets up characters in contrast to Walt. Right? We're seeing everything through Walt's eyes and through Walt's glasses, if you will. And so we see that Walt is, in a sense, clean cut on the outside, but kind of dirty on the inside, if you will, though it's gradually being more revealed. Gus is similar, completely clean and cut guy on the outside, but far more extreme really on both counts. On the other hand, Saul is kind of just consistently, what you see is what you get, dirty the whole way through. We get a same but far more menacing version of that with the cousins. But then we get Hank, and this is where I'm just, we got to talk Hank, and we'll get more down the road too. But Hank seems so rough at the outset. Hank is the guy you don't want to like early in the show. He's just kind of a jock. He's a jerk. He's just rude to people, and he kind of low key bullies Walt around. He's that brother-in-law, right? But even to the point of making quite a few racially insensitive remarks. He's brash, rough with everyone, including his wife. But when the stakes are high and when the heat gets turned up, he shows really great character and a strong moral compass. Although he is a broken man who is struggling with the weight of who he is and what he's done, he is a man of virtue at this point, at least the halfway point in the show. Of course, he falls into depression again, but he's a fascinating character.
I think the big thing with Hank, I think that the turning point, the difference with Hank between his, like you were saying, kind of his brash, cocky, prideful veneer, right? If you compare him to Walt, you get that same sort of thing, right? Walt is obviously very prideful. He's very, he gets revealed as it's a horrific pride that drives him. And the difference, I would say, between he and Hank is that Hank ultimately becomes repentant.
Yeah.
So it's the idea of repentance where because he pushes his wife away, he pushes his partner away, he makes some dumb choices. He's really prideful about certain things, but then he finally does break and he becomes repentant. And that is ultimately the difference between Walt and Hank is what I would say.
I agree. And we get moments where Hank is reflective and circumspect in ways that we would never expect from Walt. At least not the Walt that we're meeting right now, right? And I think in a way, Hank and Jesse actually have a bit of a mirroring too, where Hank is rough on the outside for reasons, but Jesse wants to be. Jesse has adopted who he is. He says, "I'm the bad guy." He accepts that, and there's something as a Christian that is willing to accept. Yeah, we're the bad guy. But what he's actually saying is, I don't know who else to be. This is who I'm going to be. I'm going to fall into this persona. I'm going to continue to adopt this and let this be who I am. Whereas Walt is in denial, but he is slipping faster and faster down that slope and has almost, you could say no say in it. But he does regularly make these decisions. Walt knows he has blood on his hand, but in some incredibly cringeworthy scenes in this show, we see Walt, the extent to which a human is capable of excusing the effects of their own sin, right? The school assembly scene. I mean,
oh man, yeah.
He's like, we move on. We're not still talking about these things.
It could have been
painful.
worse. The plane only had so many people.
It was so painful. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, wow, what a monster. And then I think, man, how often have I done something awful and then rationalized it in the way that Walt has? I mean, it's a very convicting show when you watch it mindfully. It's not a good, happy, fuzzy feeling show. But, to the point where he's saying, who I do? I blame the government. It's the government's fault. I mean, it's your fault, Walt. Come on. Like, you're looking for any single direction that you can assign blame besides this guy right here. He's just poisoned with pride. And we see that's really that's really Walt's superpower. He's a good chemist, but his superpower is pride. He's pride man.
Yeah.
For sure.
I mean, well, and that's a continuation of last season and stuff too, right? Like when they started the idea of the money laundering, and like James talked about in our last episode, when they came up with the money laundering idea, but it was accepting charity, and the way that he said the word charity, like it was such a dirty word. But it was his pride. He couldn't accept help. He couldn't accept charity. And he wanted everyone to know that he had accomplished this thing. Like he says to Skyler at one point, he's like, I've earned this money. I've earned it. I worked hard for it. I made it. I made the meth. I made the thing. And then he basically guilts her into it by saying, like, that'll all be for nothing if you don't accept what I've earned.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He's so obsessed with that idea, his recipe, that there's a fight between him and Jesse about his recipe. There's his earning of the money. I made this. I accomplished this. I did this. And like he says to Gus at one point, he's like, what? You believe I have some overweening pride you think that simply overwhelms me and clouds my judgment? Yes.
Hard nods. For those listening and not watching, we're all breaking our necks nodding.
Again.
Yeah.
Over and over again, you prove that is absolutely what drives you. And it's just, and so in that sense too, the ability for the human heart to deceive itself, right? For us to deceive ourselves about our sin, our culpability, our engagement in it is on full display in Wolf. Like you were saying, anyone else to blame, anyone else, but then deceiving yourself, justifying your actions. And it's sickening to watch, even as it's so true.
It is. And we see this denial. Like there's this great interaction with him and Jesse, where Jesse, who has just gotten clean and just spent a lot of time, pondering things, carrying the weight of guilt that is his and is not his. And he is, kind of coming back enlightened from recovery, or from rehab. You either run from things or you face them, Mr. White. It's about accepting who you really are. And then he says, in answer to who he is, he says, I'm the bad guy. And he essentially wants to be, I think that the issue is that what Jesse really wants is to not be hurt anymore. And Jesse is like the Peter Parker of this show. Jesse cannot catch a break. I mean, it's brutal. And everything seems to go wrong for him. And he has revelation after revelation, and things are gradually occurring to him and piecing them together, all but some of the biggest ones. And he's unwilling to be hurt again. And so he's willing to be the bad guy. I'm just going to go full bore into this. Meanwhile, Walt actually is becoming the bad guy, but he pushes back against it. This is great interaction. Right. Yeah. Where he's talking to Saul.
I can't be the bad guy, talking to Saul. And Saul just looks at him with this funny look. Yeah. That's crazy.
Saul's reaction is my favorite part of that. Saul's like, okay, buddy. Saul has no compulsion. Saul is the same the whole way through, it seems, right? He's not hiding much under the surface. Under those cheap suits is more cheap suits, it seems like. And he's comfortable with who he is, which go watch Better Call Saul. It's a really good show. But but Hank is really, I think, the one that shows us the best response to guilt, because Hank goes from a man, he's acting erratically. He's harsh with everyone. He's getting into bar fights. He's screaming at his wife, all this stuff. But then when the chips are down and cards are on the table, the fear that he has when he thinks Marie is gone, the fact that, you know, he breaks down, he lets his wife hold it. Oh God, it's just such the reconciliation that we see at parts of this season. Obviously it gets dicey later, but it's so good. He's admitting how much he is struggling. There's this great monologue.
That scene in the elevator, man, that was crushing. That scene in the elevator when he breaks, like, honestly, you know, as a guy, about in October celebrating my 25th anniversary, it's like, I've been there a few places. There've been several places in 25 years where I've had that breakdown moment as a guy with whatever heavy stuff was going on. That was an extremely emotional moment. Again, for all the reasons I think 3 has been so strong. Like to see him vulnerable in the elevator was so amazing. Like that was very cool.
And to see it just. Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
I was going to say, you see their relationship actually getting better, whereas Walt and Skyler are falling that much more apart. And I found that really fascinating. And I'm pretty sure I looked at James at one point and I was like, oh, Hank's so dead. He's so dead. Like, I was like, here he is actually having an epiphany and making the right choices with that epiphany. I was like,
oh yeah. We thought his character was going to die.
I was like, he's so dead. Like
in the parking lot. Oh yeah.
When you see him walking with flowers, is that when you knew it? You're like,
I was like,
bro's got
man,
purple
he's so
flowers.
dead. I was like, he's made this epiphany. He and his wife are, you know, starting to figure some stuff out. He's figuring stuff out. He had this epiphany. And then, I was like,
for as dark as this show has gone, that was surprising. I was so surprised they didn't go there. I was like, oh yeah, he's going to die now because I was like, oh, they didn't go there.
He said, I think it's going to be okay. Yeah, that's not a good sign.
Well, but then what was interesting too was then even further than after that moment, right? Because then he also fell back into some of his tropes of his pride and stuff. He didn't want to leave the hospital. He was like, I can't walk. I'm not going to do this. I can't do this. And then there was this really sweet moment between he and Marie where she finally kind of figured out how to draw him out, right? Like she and it was just this really sweet, it felt like a really true moment between a married couple who know each other pretty well, but she's kind of like, you know what, I'm gonna call you out on this. I'm not gonna take no for an answer. We're gonna make a bet, and she won, and she gets him to come home. And
I really didn't think we were going to talk about the bet, but okay.
It was so well, but it was
not in any more detail than that. But yeah,
it felt like an honest moment between a married couple, and
you actually see her grow too, because there's the earlier scene, which Kat and I talked about, where like she tries to rip stuff out of him when he's in the shower earlier in this season.
Yeah,
and we actually had an interesting debate after that. After that episode, it's like she was being an idiot. Like there is a time and place you need to read the room and know when and how to draw out your spouse. And because they were so kind of disconnected, obviously in previous seasons and knowing each other, like she just operates out of I'm just gonna throw stuff at him and try to draw him. Like, no,
push too hard. Like she pushes a little too hard.
You're pushing too hard. This is not going to end well. You're not being wise, and it doesn't end well. And that doesn't mean it's entirely her fault. That's not saying that he was right and she was wrong in that moment. But like, you have to know how to approach your spouse and draw them out. And there's a lot of Bible verses about a husband not to speak harsh to their wife, but then there's Proverbs about the nagging wife. Like there's that interplay of how to draw one another out in a loving and biblical way. It's like we're seeing some people struggle through that in this season, which is really cool. Like it was very cool, raw, and honest. And like she failed, but then she figured out a way, albeit kind of saucy. She figures out the right way to draw him out, and it was like that was actually kind of humorous. And yet real. So like, I applaud the show for having it be for able to go there,
Which,
even though
again,
it was a little awkward for us to maybe watch. But
And
which
as long as
again,
we're
though,
on the
is a
subject,
contrast.
sorry, as long as we're on the subject, I will note that at one point a phrase is repeated from an earlier episode. You have 1 minute. And so,
Right,
anyway,
right.
I'm done. That's
Well,
it.
but,
There we
but
go.
it also then it's that contrast. Like, I think season 3 is very much about those contrasts of
Yeah.
you have Hank and Marie's marriage, which is actually becoming more vulnerable and better as they actually do open up and become vulnerable with each other and help encourage each other, help draw each other out, help them toward the ultimate goal for each other's betterment. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
And then you have Walt and Skyler, who are just falling into bitterness, and how that bitterness is just betrayal, lies, deceit, betrayal, and then bitterness at those lies, deceit, and betrayal, and how that just is corroding their entire world.
yeah. But to Hank's credit, he has moments of confession, and then
Absolutely. And repentance.
confession and forgiveness, and all those things show
He
up.
does.
And-
There's this great monologue that he has where he's talking to Marie, and it turns into a monologue, which I won't read the whole thing, but there's this great scene where I notice they're not facing each other. They're facing away. He's facing a task that's ahead of him. And he says, I swear to God, Marie, I think the universe is trying to tell me something. And you guys have really helped me start paying more attention when people take God's name in vain in shows, because I think maybe sometimes there's more to it than they realize. I swear there's something that's trying to tell me something. I'm finally ready to listen. I'm just not the man that I thought I was, he says. Man, how many guys, and for that matter, ladies listening to this podcast, come to the realization we're not who we thought we were going to be. And that causes us to have to really ask some hard questions and to come to the feet of the cross ultimately. But what we see here is the relationship. You're right. The contrast between Walt and Skyler, who are trying to make it appear that things are okay with them when they're desperately failing and awful. Meanwhile, Hank and Marie, if you contrast that, Hank and Marie, he's crying in her arms on the elevator, and then the door opens, right? And he's got to put the tough guy back on. Like, it seems exhausting to be Hank. Like, as much as it's exhausting to be Walt, it seems pretty exhausting to be Hank too. But what I think about this, all of this shows, right, is that with Jesse to a degree, but more with Hank, there's some value in this confession, right? And so we see that 1 John 1 has a lot to say about this. It says in verse 8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And then it repeats again, if we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us. And just that seems like a perfect verse to contrast the fact that we have Walt, who is insistent and indignant and prideful against the sin that is in his life. Meanwhile, you have Jesse, who, if anything, is piling more guilt on himself than is due. But Jesse's partly right. We should accept who we really are, but not who we define ourselves to be, and not become comfortable and complacent with that. And so I think there's even like a bit of a devotional takeaway, if you will, which is not always what we do here, but it's convicting for me to see this and say, don't accept those faults of who you are as inevitable. That's, yes, we're fallen and we're sinful, but that's not the end of the story.
Right.
Just like this isn't the end of this story. So,
well, and I think Hank's repentance is a huge piece as well, because there's that moment too when after he attacks Jesse, and then he says, like, all of his cop friends are even like, is this the statement you really want to make? Because it's the truth. I was not seeking justice, and I attacked this guy unprovoked and inappropriately and in a horrific manner. And I will put everything that was my identity before this, being a cop, being a DEA agent, all of that kind of stuff. He was like, that is no longer my identity. And I need to walk in the light and be truthful, because this is what happened. And I might be ashamed of it, but I'm going to repent of it and then stand in that repentance. And that was a huge thing. And that's absolutely nothing that you see from Jesse and Walt. Even when Jesse starts skimming off of the top, and when Walt accuses him of it, and Jesse gets indignant, and you're like, but you are.
Yeah.
How dare you say I'm stealing? But you are.
Yeah.
and both Jesse and Walt walk that line of like being indignant at getting called out at something they're absolutely guilty of.
Mm-hmm.
And with Hank, this was this stunning moment of repentance and vulnerability that was really, really cool to see.
It was. And of course, he's in the hot seat for a lot of it, but there are moments. After he beats Jesse, he looks around, he's on his own, he's alone. He could have walked away. There could have been any number of people who attacked Jesse. Of course, he would have said something eventually, but maybe not.
Right.
Go to the cops. That's not what drug dealers are known to do. But he calls the ambulance. It's off camera, but it's implied. He's the one who calls the ambulance. He makes it all happen because he immediately realizes what he's done. It's incredible. And we see so much depth of character with Hank, who frankly seems like a secondary, tertiary background character early on in the show. And or the dumb cop that can't quite get, the kind of, you just can't quite catch the guy. But there's just something about where they're going with all the characters. Even Marie. Marie was insufferable for most of the show. Just the worst.
Right.
but she's kind of coming around in some ways. And so anyway, excellent stuff. So Kat, what was the main theme that stood out to you?
So I think I had a weird moment in regards to some of the money. There was a sequence when Walt was bringing Skyler into stuff, and he basically sets out the duffel bag of money and proceeds to tell her, like, this is
groceries.
This is security
college.
For a family. This is groceries. This is healthcare. This is parties. This is the mortgage that you're not going to be able to pay. And
college tuition.
College tuition, physical therapy for our son. Like he lays out all of the things that the money can provide. And that's absolutely true. All of those things that money can provide is true. But I was kind of struck then, like it's these little compromises that she then starts to make in relationship to that money. She starts to see that, and when Hank is injured, then she's like, okay, she sort of thinks she's sticking it to Walt, right, by saying, we're going to use, this is your fault, we're going to use this money to help Hank. But it's still almost this, like, there's this weird, to put it in biblical terms, I guess maybe kind of like the worship of Mammon, that idea of like worshiping money as your security, worshiping being willing to do anything for the money. And so Skyler using those ill-gotten gains, which might be part of her character's control issues and some things of that nature. At least I can control the money. If I can control the money, I can use it for good. And so I'm using these ill-gotten gains. And even Walt then thinks that money justifies the destruction that he's causing because he's providing security for his family by using that money. And I actually had a weird resonating moment when he was showing her all that money and listing all that stuff, because I tend to be a planner. I tend to
no, really?
And you would obviously know that. So I struggle with that sometimes, my plan versus God's provision. And how do I reconcile being a good steward of the things that God has provided me with, but then ultimately trusting in God's provision, because I can get really far into the weeds on like my retirement funds and planning or debt consolidation or whatever. I have spreadsheets upon spreadsheets, and I can lean really heavily into that in a way that makes that more my security blanket than the Lord and his provision. And so weirdly enough, while I was watching that scene, I actually kind of felt convicted. Like that thinking that I was seeing in the show is an absolute trap that I struggle against and fall into quite regularly. And I remember thinking, this is absolutely where I can go if I'm not careful, if I am not watchful about my heart and how I feel about money and the planning and the security that it provides. That's something I actually need to repent of quite often. And that's how you justify those little compromises. That's how that's how Skyler starts saying, well, we can use the money for good. We can use it to help Hank. We can use it for these things. And it kind of becomes this, look at the fruit, don't look at where it came from. And scripture actually has a lot to say about ill-gotten gains. And so Proverbs 10:2 actually says, treasures gained by wickedness do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. Proverbs 16:8, better is little with righteousness than great income with injustice. And then even Proverbs 21:6 says, the acquisition of treasures by a lying tongue is a fleeting vapor, the pursuit of death. And there's another one too in Habakkuk 2:9, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. Again, that idea, if you're putting your security in the temporal money and you're willing then to sin to get it, to throw over others to get it, that's not trusting in the Lord to help you weather those hard times or weather those things. And that's a hard thing to walk through. It's a hard thing to live through. And those decisions can be really difficult, but it leads you to those small compromises. And I'm assuming Skyler's going to fall even farther down that rabbit hole as we go. And then you see too.
We don't know. We don't know.
I don't
yet.
know, but I can only imagine like where we're headed with her character, right? Because she's starting to say, "I'm a bookkeeper. I can do this. I'll come on and help you launder this money so that we can, use it for good." And then even you see that money never satisfies, even within the context of the show. Walt had an original number that was supposed to be, I'm going to make this number and I'm out.
Yeah.
And now it's more. Jesse bought his parents' house back in kind of a fit of revenge or pique, if you will. And then he's not satisfied. And even that, I was like, oh my gosh, you're such an idiot. You didn't even think it through. Oh, I spent all this money to buy the house back, but I have no furniture. And I've spent all that money. How am I gonna pay for food? Oh, I guess I'll start selling meth again because I'm a genius. Like it just, and then it doesn't satisfy. Like you can tell he starts craving more. And then he gets $1.5 million by helping Walt and immediately starts saying, we deserve a bigger cut.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's just, and he starts skimming off the top, even though it's super dangerous and he doesn't seem to understand exactly what he's getting into. And again, it just shows this, like the lack of judgment, the lack of wisdom that comes with chasing that as your security or what. And it was really interesting that I had this very visceral, convicting moment watching that scene where I was like, oh, that is a danger for me. Not that I'm going to go cook meth, just so we're clear, but that idea of putting my security in the money rather than the fact that it's God providing that for our family. Sorry, I've been on for a bit, but
it can easily become an idol. It can become a source of pride. Yeah. And it's a huge theme in this season. I think it's a massive theme. Yeah.
Well, I think that, as I remember kind of watching that scene where Walt is talking to Skyler, like it felt to me much like a scene of maybe what we think of like Satan in the garden with Eve, just like tempting. This is the tempter in the garden. This is the bite on the fruit of this. Instead of fruit, it's money. It's this bag of money. And to your point earlier, it's like, I think everybody in this season is exposed for their worship of Mammon. And there may be some listeners who are like, Mammon, what's he talking about? They're like, well, it's this idea of Matthew 6:24. Jesus says, no one can serve two masters, since either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Modern translations will say money, but the word is mammon. It's a Semitic term for the treasure a person trusts in. Right? And Scripture would have our treasure be to treasure Christ. Treasure Christ above money, treasure Christ instead of money. And everybody in this season is looking not to Christ, but to money for their security. For Pinkman, as you said, it's a cause of jealousy. It's for Walt, it's an issue of control. That's how he's controlling the situation. And everyone is worshiping Mammon to some degree. And that was just so interesting to me. Even then, and even there's that possibility that Marie / Hank, it's like, well, they're now going to accept this money.
Yeah.
I was like, money is kind of becoming this solution for everything, which in an earthly sense, it seems like it is, but it is finite. And
well, Proverbs even says something to that
it,
effect as well. The money is the solution for everything. In the right
money's the solution for everything. Like, in an earthly sense, it is. But it's like, are we going to have a higher call or a higher placement? So it's fascinating to see how everybody's corrupted in that way, and that was something I know, Kat, with us talking. I like that everybody being corrupted was kind of your.
That was kind of a secondary piece, like the Mammon, but then also how they're starting to corrupt each other. Right? Yeah. Again, it's kind of that. Was it? I didn't write it down, but is it 1 Corinthians? James will probably know it right off the top of his head. That idea of like bad company
corrupts good morals.
Yeah.
And that idea gets played out, right? Jesse and Walt, by the end of the season, Jesse and Walt are now murderers for each other. And again, it comes from this idea of like, oh, but I was protecting Jesse. Oh, but I'm protecting Walt. No, but you're still murdering people. Yeah. And you're justifying it. And then Skyler's starting to get into the money laundering. I can do that. I can use my skills, right? I'm a bookkeeper. Yay. You're like, no, don't use your skills for evil.
That's what Walt did.
Even the one-ups, even the one-upsmanship that happens in this season, it is still sad in that Skyler then compromises herself in the episode, IFT, which stands for I something to Ted.
Yeah.
And we talked about this in the last episode, where it's not that we're saying Skyler did nothing wrong or Skyler is the angel and Walt is the devil, but this strange and unerring hatred of Skyler. It's like she only gives to him or has done to him. She's doing eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So again, anyone who wants to hate on Skyler, it's like, okay, you have to hate Walt just as much then, because she's found another way now that her infidelity is no more or less than his sin against their family and all the terrible things that he's done. I think culturally sometimes we're like, oh, the woman cheated. Oh, it's this like extra, like, is it really such an extra sin?
Yeah.
Like what she does, it's not the cheating. It's not the infidelity with another man that's really her issue. Walt is able to come into their family, not just their family, but there's that great episode where he makes the police think that she is the idiot. Right. She is the stupid one. He's making her son think that she is the stupid one as he sits there with a smile on his face. Yeah. Feeling like,
and so, I'm holding the baby. Look at me. I'm so innocent and helpful.
It is very menacing.
It's gaslighting. It's so frustrating.
So her cheating isn't about the infidelity. It's giving her a position of power to where she can now sit with a smile on her face, and he's the one who now has to hold it all in and suck it in and act normal. It's a repayment for that scene at the dinner table. It's a dinner table exchange of power. And while we can't forgive Skyler for her sin, like it is matching him for his sin. So for anybody to put more sin on Skyler is kind of ridiculous. Like equal sin, like they're matching one another's sin and in a form of one-upsmanship to create a power balance, and it's sad and tragic. And neither is justified more than the other.
It's this grotesquerie of like you were saying, it's a grotesquerie of like sin begetting sin and their bitterness, them repaying sin with sin, which we're not supposed to repay evil with evil. And it's honestly, it comes from, it's them slowly, the circle of corruption gets wider and wider, right? As Walt is just this black hole sucking everything into horribleness. Yeah. But it also comes from, that corrupting influence comes from people refusing to repent and walk in the light. Like, that's where the corruption comes from. You can stop that corrupting influence by repenting, right? That's what Hank does.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm not going to be this angry, horrible person anymore. I'm going to repent. I'm going to take the consequences for my actions. And Walt does not want the consequences for his actions. Jesse doesn't want the consequences for their actions. And Skyler runs into the problem of, I don't want other people to experience the consequences of this person's actions. So she keeps all of Walt's sins in the dark because she's trying to protect her son from knowing what a horrible person Walter is. And ultimately, that's ultimately not helpful. That Band-Aid of your dad is a meth dealer and a liar and a deceiver, I'm sorry, but if that's what he is and who he's done, what he's done,
to be ripped off. Yeah.
It has to be ripped off. The light has to be shown on that, and continuing to cover that up is just making things worse.
Yeah.
And,
But again,
and just
but again, for all the Skyler haters, you just said the right phrase. She's repaying evil for evil. So if you're going to be upset at her evil, you have to be equally upset at the evil she's repaying.
Yeah.
Which would
Yes.
be Walt.
Yeah, and one.
as well. And oh, sorry.
No, you're good. I'm having trouble finding the quote in here, but there's a really great discussion in here about kind of. I think we're viewing a lot of what's happening in the context of Walt as kind of like bumbling his way through the drug trade, right? I mean, you know, he's managing to defend himself. He's managing to do what's right in the situation, like you said, kind of an escape route thing. He's great in a pinch, right? But he's not a long-term planner, and ultimately, we're dealing with a guy who is gradually going from being I better get the gun away from this guy. Oh, I better defend myself. I better do this, to someone who's willing to say, it's him or us. We're going to take him out. And he's willing to pull the trigger, and he's willing to even compromise Jesse's relative innocence. Jesse's never ended a life until the end of this season, right? Like up until this point, all of the lives who have been lost, the body count is all on Walt. Even though some of it's indirect,
Now
through
it's
Hank
Jesse.
and through, other means. But in terms of the ultimate responsibility, Walt is far more corrupted than in a lot of ways. And so, we really do see a lot of that, like you said, that corruption eking its way out.
That, and then this sick desire to keep it hidden, right? As long as I can keep it hidden, I can keep the facade up that I'm righteous, I can justify myself. And Scripture actually speaks very clearly to that. In John 3:20, it says, "For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come into the light, lest his works should be exposed." Because if you get exposed, you have to deal with the consequences. And Jeremiah 16:17 says, "For my eyes," the Lord, "are on all their ways. They are not hidden from me, nor is their iniquity concealed from my eyes." And as I was looking up some of those verses, I was reminded of Psalm 94, where it's talking about the enemies of Israel specifically, but it's people who say of the Lord does not see. The God of Jacob does not perceive. And then the psalmist goes on to say, "Understand, O dullest of the people, fools, when will you be wise? He who planted the ear, does he not hear? He who formed the eye, does he not see? He who disciplines the nations, does he not rebuke? He who teaches man knowledge, the Lord, knows the thoughts of man, that they are but a breath." And I love that idea. Like, the Lord gave you that ear. Do you think he doesn't understand what you're using it for? The Lord made that eye. Do you not think he understands what you're using it for? You say he doesn't see. You think that you can hide your iniquity from him. And I was just really struck by that again, like, because we were talking about Skyler, I think slightly off topic, or before the podcast, we were talking about Skyler and her lawyer, which then contrasts Saul, Walt's lawyer, Skyler's lawyer, whereas Skyler's lawyer gives her the righteous advice, right?
Oh, yeah.
Don't spend the money, call the cops, turn him in, and lay it all out in the light. And Skyler's like, oh, I can't do that. It would destroy Walt Jr.
Yeah.
Right. And so she hides it. She covers it up. And then she ends up not fully divorcing him. Why? So that she can basically have some kind of deniability to say, oh, spouses can't
be compelled to
testify against each other. So I'm protecting you and I'm protecting them. And again, it's this horrible sin that's a guise of protecting the family.
See,
and
that ties in. I think that ties into my, like you say the word, you say the phrase "not fully." Like she's not fully doing this. She's not fully embracing that. Like somebody's upset, but they're not fully going all the way. And that really was the thing that stood out to me, which ties into the Mike speech, which we've been talking, dancing around this whole episode. Like everyone, Skyler, everyone, even in their indignance, in their upset, in their plans, like they're all only willing to go about halfway. Like it's all half measures, and that was the theme that really stood out to me, was that speech by Mike about no half measures. And I think it's a commentary about human nature. And of course, when he gives the speech, it's a commentary about his frustration when he was a cop, right? He takes this, that he knew what this guy would do. He takes this guy out, puts a gun in his mouth. He threatens him. He thinks, but he doesn't pull the trigger. He does a half measure. He thinks like, maybe I can scare this guy. I can put the fear of me into him. And it doesn't work. And this guy ends up killing his girl, and everything he tried. It's sad to see Mike now as this broken cop who's just sort of embraced nihilism. I mean, in some ways, it's just he's sort of embraced he's embraced nihilism, but yet he's now going to be, in his own way, he's going to meet out full measure as he tries to. But it's interesting. His commentary, I think, really speaks to a biblical idea that law can restrain people in some ways that help civilization, but what he's communicating is they don't change hearts. Like laws or even threats or even fear doesn't change a person's nature.
Yeah.
And we see that not just in that story that he tells, but in all our main characters too. Like laws and threats, like the fear of punishment, none of that actually changes anybody's base nature. Like Jesse was mortified about what happened to Jane. Like what happened to Jane in some ways is almost like the gun in the mouth, right? Like that's like, what have I done? It's like he's got a gun in his mouth. What happened to me? My actions led to what happened to Jane. But then what does he do? He starts selling meth to his fellows in recovery.
Yeah.
It's like those proverbs that say a dog returns to its vomit. Like he goes back to his worst impulses. And Walt says he doesn't want to be the bad guy, but literally at the end of the season, when the gun's in his mouth at the end of the season, he commissions a murder.
Yeah.
Right? It's interesting because we sometimes, I think sometimes non-Christians, but even some Christians, they look at the God and especially they look at God in the Old Testament and they kind of partition it in weird ways. They're not thinking through their theology or the kind of full doctrine, but they're like, wow, God seems really harsh and judgmental. It's like, no, God knows there can be no half measures with sin. There can be no half measures with sin or sin nature. It can't just be swept under the rug. It can't just be winked at. It can't it has to be dealt with in this decisive way, which comes into sacrifice, atonement, blood sacrifice, and the cross. Like the magnitude of how redemption happens, and of course the magnitude of what will happen to people who are outside of that redemption is severe. Like hell is real. Like they say, even some pulpits don't want to talk about hell these days. Like almost as if God is too harsh. He's like, no, God is saying, like Mike, there can be no half measures. Like people like this guy in Mike's story will just go back to their sin, and it kills, it destroys, it ruins, it's so hard. What's that?
It's the tepid thing too. If you're trying to do a half measure and you're lukewarm, God says he'll spit you out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if Mike's speech resonated with you guys that way, but that's what I came with. I was just like this whole, like, that's right. There can't be any half measures because we don't like to think about how the depth of our wickedness and our depravity, the depravity of man. There's a good Calvinist term for you. There's like the depravity of man goes so deep that we don't like to think about the fact that there really must be something extreme that has to happen, because there can't be half measures with us. And like that hit me as a minister, like that hit me deep, like that.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's indicative of the whole season too. It's all of the justifications that you see Walt and Jesse do, right? It's meth, but I'm not the dealer.
Yeah.
I'm just the chemist. I respect the chemistry, so I made this cool product. What people do with it is not my fault. What happens to people who use it is not my fault.
Yeah.
And they're trying to justify and assuage their own guilty conscience at the level of their culpability and their sin. And we all do it.
Yeah.
We all do it. The heart's deceitful. And we will absolutely try to say, oh, my sin isn't as bad as that sin, or my sin isn't even really that bad at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so here's where I'm going to get weird with you guys just for a minute. Here's where it gets weird. I'm just going to say it, throw it out there, and it could be a soundbite. So in a weird way, coming out of the season, I feel like not only do I admire Mike, but I admire the Salamanca cousins.
What?
Like, I admire the cousins. There you go.
La familia
Just gonna
es
say it.
todo.
Mic drop.
Explain
Yeah.
how.
Explain yourself, sir. Yeah.
And here's why. Because all the characters otherwise in this show, maybe Gus fits in the category there where I could almost admire Gus. Like all the other characters are wafflers. Wafflers. And I look at... I don't agree with the cousins, and I don't agree with Mike, and I don't agree with Gus, but I agree with them that there's no half measures, and that for the Christian, there's no half measures with the gospel.
Yeah.
Right? There is a resolute nature to the, like when you see the cousins, they are so dedicated to their mission that nothing interrupts it.
Yeah.
Nothing compromises it. Nothing stands in its way. Like they have a path. They're going to walk the path. No one can convince them to deviate from the path. They're going to be resolute. Like that's a word that I love. Like they're so resolute. And when you look at, like, that's honestly the call of the Christian. Not obviously to killing cops, not obviously to
I don't remember the
sneaking
axes.
into somebody's
Yeah,
house.
yeah.
Just to
Right.
be clear.
Not with axes, but Jesus in Matthew 16:25 says, the one who loses his life, the one who's willing to lose his life for me will find it. Right? Matthew 24,
Right.
he says, the one who perseveres to the end will be saved. Like that. Matthew 10:33 says, if you deny me before man, I'll deny you before the Father. Like, there is a resolute, unyielding nature to the gospel, even to the fact that there will be division. Like Jesus again even talks about who are my mother and brothers. They're the ones who are actually resolute to the mission with me, right? Like, who are my cousins? Like you look at those two guys, like they're resolute together. Like, who are the people? Like our actions as Christians are vastly different from these characters that we see that are resolute, but our commitment and our fortitude should be the same. And you're looking at all these other characters. I think, was it you or Kat earlier said, like with Gus, like meekness is not weakness.
Yeah.
Like he comports himself in a meek way, but there's nothing weak about his meekness. I think about like other protagonists in other shows that we see. I think like you see the John Wick character, and the John Wick, like he sets himself to a course. He is unyielding in that course. There's a great movie called Equilibrium with Christian Bale. It's like you set yourself to the course. You're on that course. Like Steve Rogers or Captain America could, like, I can do this all day. I'm going to be resolute on my principles. Superman, same way. Like, so I'm equating Superman and the Salamanca brothers. Like that's
Wow. Yeah.
But they're right. Like there's something in them that they're unyielding in their dedication to the course of action without deviation. Like Scripture says, like, do not turn to the right or to the left. Like, stay the course. And there's something aspirational about that. That like, man, I should aspire to that. Like you look at Walt trying to be a certain way, but he's always like flip flopping and waffling.
Yeah.
And like you look at all these other characters. There's Skyler being like, all these other characters are compromised, and And most people are like Walt, like Christians and non-Christians. Even Christians were like, okay, I love Jesus, but I keep stumbling and I get distracted or I get tempted. It's like we flounder. Like people who are actually dedicated to wickedness, I think their conscience even makes them flounder. Mm-hmm. Like we see that in characters in Breaking Bad. Like they're content with being wicked, but then their conscience kicks in and they kind of even flounder in their wickedness. And then I think we see characters who are trying to be righteous flounder on that too. And either of those things disgust me more than dedication. I'd rather see somebody dedicated to righteous. Well, I want to see them dedicated to righteousness, but when I see somebody dedicated to a wicked course, it's like, at least they're dedicated.
I was going to say,
the floundering is what is the more disgusting thing is the floundering.
Yeah.
It's like devote.
What's the Batman Returns thing? It's not the psychos don't scare me. At least they're committed.
Yeah. That's like, that Batman Returns. Great
Nice.
callback. That's like all the way back to 1992. But right. What disgusts me more than dedication is the waffler, even in their right or wrong path. Like somebody claims to be if somebody isn't a Christian, but they claim to be of another religion, but they aren't consistent. It's like, well, that's frustrating. Be consistent with our worldview. I think that's something where the dedicated characters so far in this show, they're on the wrong path, but there's still something kind of weirdly admirable about their dedication.
And I think that's one of the biggest things is that if we look at Walt and Jesse, really our two journeyers, the two that are journeying through the show, they are making their way through, and they are seeing all these people who are committed and they are compelled. And I want to say that we see in Hank someone who is resolute and is committed to righteousness, but there's so much more under the surface with Hank, right? It's not clean. There's a lot of pride, there's a lot of self-protection involved, but I agree. Like what would it look like to see someone with the resoluteness of the Salamancas, for righteousness? I mean, I'm thinking of Christ setting his face like a flint to Jerusalem. I'm thinking of those who the men who sold themselves into slavery in order to share the gospel with those on remote islands. I mean, there's no shortage of stories among martyrs and among missionaries who had that resoluteness, who were who set their face like a flint. They were not to be deterred, and that is incredibly admirable. There's this great. I didn't want to go too far down this road, but this idea of what is a man? What does a man do? There's this incredibly manipulative moment that we see, and this might be a decent transition actually into, if you guys don't mind, we'll just jump into our lightning round.
Bring it on.
Where we're gonna play a pretty quick game of receive, reject, redeem. I will say that one of the things, just because I already started the transition, I'm going to jump down to a redeem point. In an effort to manipulate Walt into cooking for him, Gus plays on his desire to provide for his family. He said, what is a man? A man provides. Even when he is not loved, even when he is not respected, a man still provides. And he buckles up and he does it. There's something about that is very compelling as a man. There's something about it as well that is very sinister, right? This says, but to what end and at what cost? I think that there's something to be redeemed out of that. A man's job is to provide, but not just to provide money. It's to provide stability. It's to provide a role model for your family. It's to provide spiritual leadership. It's to provide someone that your child can look up to. Because what is it worth if your family finds out, even after you're gone, and there's this memory and this scar upon your family as a result of what you've done? So I would throw that in the redeem category. But it's easy to jump back and maybe discuss what can we reject from this film. James, it sounds like waffling. So that's a category of what many of these characters do that we can just toss right out the window. Anything else?
Quotes out of context.
I believe there's a character in the movie Mystery Men that's literally his superpower is called the Waffler, and I think he should just be rejected. But there's this, like we see these characters that just they obviously lack a foundation. They lack a gospel. I mean, we joke. Richard Foltz, one of the founders of popcorn theology, right? His renowned for always saying, by what standard? It's like, well, these guys have no standards, so they're just waffling.
Yeah.
And so we see these odd characters that are, like, honestly, that's why I'd say maybe that's not a reject, that's a redeem. We see characters that have unyielding resolve to a cause, and I think, wow, that should be the Christian. There are no half measures in following Jesus. So I'll reject the Salamanca brothers' direction, but I can redeem their resolute nature in that. As far as a reject, I'd say, as Kat already alluded to, there seem to be a bunch of people trying to figure out how to use evil for good, in that, like, this money has been earned through evil means, but I can kind of get into the game and turn it around so it can be for good purposes. I was like, no, God, I think in Scripture, God can use evil for good. He never actually allows man to be the arbiter of that. So that's a fine line where, yes, we can see in Scripture that God uses something that was meant for evil, and he turns it around so it comes out for the good of those that he loves and cares about and is providing for. But we're never called as humans to do that. In the same way, we're not to take vengeance. We leave that to God. We also can't, I'll use this evil thing, but I'll use it in a way that maybe I can spin for good. Like, no, we can't be Skyler. We can't do those things. That's way out. Yeah.
That doesn't justify it. It's kind of that the ends justify the means, or I've seen a lot of people say, well, like, look at the fruit, right? We're doing this bad thing, but all of this fruit, this good fruit, is coming out of it. And I think Scripture actually speaks pretty clearly to that a good tree produces good fruit, a bad tree produces bad fruit. You might think that it looks good, but it's bad. And
it's gonna rot.
Yeah.
It's gonna rot. And it has a corrupting influence that you don't even fully understand. Yeah. And so I do see a lot of that, and those little compromises, like you really do have to be ever watchful of your thoughts and your heart and your desires, that they're in alignment with the Lord, that they're in alignment with Scripture. You're constantly testing those things, because it can be really easy to fall into the trap of, what's your identity? It's my job, not my place as a child of God. What's my identity or my security? It's money or the things that I've worked for, rather than, again, God and how he might provide. Or just sometimes the sad truth is, there are some things that we have to weather, and we're not necessarily promised ease. Even God's provision doesn't necessarily mean ease. And so it can be really easy to be like, well, yeah, it'd be great if we had a ton of money. And that's God's provision, that I should expect, well, if I expect God's going to provide, then he's going to provide me with the money to do it. Well, no, sometimes he provides you with the strength to weather that hard thing. Yeah. And so I would say, rejecting the easy route of relying on momentary temporal things as your security blanket, that would be something to reject. Rejecting the temptation to make those little compromises. Well, I can do this thing because it's not so bad. Yeah. Rejecting the idea that the ends justify the mean, or that the fruit, what seems like good fruit,
taxes.
justifies using the money in that's been gotten through unjust means. So, and I would also reject not repenting.
Yeah.
Like, that sounds, maybe that sounds like a big E on the eye chart, but you see it with Walt and Jesse, and then even Skyler, like, not throwing that wide and saying, just shine the light on it, burn out the sin, burn out the decay and the pus of that infection that is sin. Yeah. Just rip the Band-Aid off, burn it out. That's what needs to happen. That's the only way it can be cleansed. That's the only way you can get rid of it. Trying to keep it under wraps, trying to keep it from being exposed is never going to do anyone any good. And at this point,
Hank's haphazard manly man confessions are the stuff we can redeem and receive.
Yeah,
Right, yeah.
absolutely. Because I can just see at this point, if and when it comes out, what's been going on. Now, not only will Walt Jr. be horrified at what his father's done, he now gets to be horrified at what his mother's done too.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about we're seeing Skyler start to be compromised the same way that Walt is compromised, right? I mean, and it's the show's called Breaking Bad. It's not called Walt is Breaking Bad, right? I mean, it's so these characters are turning Jesse as well. I mean, and so we see so much in this show. I mean, really, it is a master class in sin, in the way that sin works, the way it corrupts, and the way that it. The temptation to return to it. I mean, it really is a case study in sin. And as far as things to reject, I mean, there's so much on the surface, obviously the violence, but I think even, things like conflating justice with revenge, or for that matter, Kat, you mentioned earlier, the ends justifying the means. That was one of my reject points too, was viewing pragmatism as an acceptable philosophy, right? Because that's essentially how Walt operates is, well, it doesn't matter what I do as long as I only ever had you in my heart, as he says in the pilot episode, that's nice. What was in your heart, but what's on your hands? And they're covered in blood at this point. But, and then I would say, as far as receive and redeem points, I mean, we already talked a good bit about this, but the fact that we see some neat pictures of marital reconciliation, I mean, it's really encouraging and enlightening. I mean, it's not, without complication, right? But it is lovely to see that. And then, of course, the importance of acknowledging the sin and the consequences of it, because again, the consequences are just so on the surface, and they resonate outward. And it's like throwing a rock into a pond, right? Those ripples are going to be spreading out further. And as we can see, the way that this season ends might be worth just kind of reminding us is that Jesse, who up until this point has been trying to be the bad guy, but is eventually willing to admit and say, I can't do it, Mr. White. I can't do it. We can't do this. He tries to talk him out of it. Go to the cops. You can get out of this. Jesse is coming to his senses, and then he does this, and then he is forced to as a result of these actions. It is so heartbreaking. It's probably one of the most heartbreaking moments in the whole show to me. And this is over Gale, right? A character that we've not grown to love necessarily, but we've grown to see as not a threat, as someone who's never going to hurt a fly. He's a vegan or whatever, you know what I mean? Like all of these things, he's not a threat. He's not going to hurt you. So yeah, it's definitely a great look at the effects of sin. And, there's a lot more we're going to discuss obviously in future seasons, but I'm hoping that from obviously more discussion in the Facebook group, the Discord server, and all the other places that people chat about movies and the best TV show ever made, in my humble opinion. So thank you guys so much. I love having the Harlemans with me on these episodes. And so I'm looking forward to the next one, which will be in a couple of months. So when you're hearing this, you got a couple of months to make your way through season 4 before the next episode.
And when we'll be like, oh, we were wrong about everything.
I admire your...
Except one thing, I will say, for all of the people who have said that Bryan Cranston, it's a masterclass in acting from Bryan Cranston, which it absolutely is. Honestly, Aaron Paul is matching him in so many ways. There's such nuanced acting from both of them. It's really, really stunning to behold. So props.
It's amazing.
To him.
They were going to kill him in like somewhere in season 2. Like they were going to off his character. He was just going to be his gateway, Walt's gateway into the drug trade, and then get killed off. And it's such a testament to him as an actor. Oh, you didn't know that? Yeah, yeah. It's such a testament to him as an actor that They told him after the fact. They're like, yeah, we liked you so much, and the dynamic between the two of you is so perfect. And again, they keep orbiting one another. They keep pushing away and then coming back, and pushing away and coming back. And obviously, there's more to see and discuss. I admire your self-control for not watching ahead. I really thought, obviously, this is a cliffhanger of a season finale, But yeah, we'll have to dive more into it next time. So we'll punt on this for a couple months. Just want to remind you guys, go ahead and share and subscribe, rate and review us on iTunes, wherever it is that you listen. Please consider supporting us on Patreon. This In the Lobby content is great stuff, in my humble opinion. We're just really glad to be able to provide for you guys, and you get a free taste once a month of those. So I want to encourage you to go ahead and check out the rest of those. By the time you hear this, there should be another one just a couple days away from making its way out into the airwaves. So absolutely. Well, until next time, keep engaging movies, media, and television from a godly perspective. And remember that you are not a mindless consumer. Thanks for watching this episode of Popcorn Theology. For more content, subscribe on YouTube. Follow and interact on social media to help broaden the conversation. Check out our archive of past episodes at popcorntheology.com or wherever you listen to podcasts, and consider becoming a patron saint by supporting us on Patreon, which lets you interact, influence, and enjoy exclusive bonus content.